Today, I dig deep with Colonel Shawn Smith, 2020 elections, cybersecurity expert and analyst, today on the David Rutherford Show. Colonel Smith, it is a real privilege and an honor to welcome you to the show today. I'd love to just jump right in. And can you explain what advanced persistent threats are in relation to what you've learned from the 2020 election fiasco?
Sure. An advanced persistent threat is a characterization of an adversary, typically nation state, almost exclusively nation state or nation state affiliated because of the resources required to generate that kind of expertise and focus and support it. You see some of that expertise in international and non-governmental like criminal organizations, but by and large, the advanced persistent threats are nation state owned, operated, or sponsored. You know, sometimes they'll use a cutout for plausible deniability. An advanced persistent threat, so you've got two aspects to it there. There's two adjectives. One is advanced. This means these are not, what we would call like script kiddies. This is not somebody messing around like war games. This is not accidental. These are people with years and sometimes decades long nation state campaigns that are intended to penetrate, compromise, and exploit vulnerabilities in Western technology, not just as if they come upon them, as if they had nothing to do with them, but also they're involved in the supply chain frequently. So there's some nation states like China that are doing a lot of manufacturing of electronics and computers, and they have intentionally woven compromises into the supply chain. So they work hand in hand between their sort of research institutions like CACA or CASC, CACC. Those work alongside the advanced persistent threat elements from their intelligence and military communities, so that the intelligence and military communities are being essentially delivered tools and access in Western technology. And it's across all elements of national security. So it's the, diplomatic realm, informational realm. It is financial realm, as well as military or defense industrial. And so an advanced persistent threat is advanced in terms of their expertise, skill set, and tools. And then the persistence is the part that most people don't understand. So you can't, we talk about red teaming. People sometimes have heard the term red teaming. Red team just means pretending to be the adversary. What we used to do in the military, even, which is probably the most well-developed and capable among U.S. national security institutions in terms of its cyber defensive and offensive capability, in particular the cyber defensive. Department of Defense spends $8 to $12 billion per year on cyber, primarily on defense, but also on offensive capabilities. The military understands that you cannot emulate a persistent threat, one that has been preparing for that battlefield or for their execution of particular vulnerabilities and compromises. You can't emulate that with somebody who just shows up on site. You have to have a persistent operation where you are, inserting people into companies 5 years before you want to take advantage of that insertion in an operational sense. So there's two elements to the threat: advanced and persistent. There are, from a public open source standpoint, there are more than 30 advanced persistent threats. There are far more than that. Most of them are clearly associated with a particular nation state: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. There are a few others, like there's some in India, but the lion's share of resources in terms of manpower and other facilities and that kind of thing, China, and then Russia, and then probably Iran and North Korea. North Korea's was focused more on sort of financial exploitation. China's was focused and has been, Russia has been focused sort of on their own defense in a sense, as well as financial exploitation. China has been focused for at least 20 years on defeating the West. which makes it, unfortunate and in a sense tragic that we offshored so much of our manufacturing and sourcing of electronics and computers to the People's Republic of China, because it's just an open door for them to exploit all of that access.
And that's what's fascinating to me. Everybody, I think, has been incredibly comfortable with acknowledging that, one, China has been an advancing and growing threat over the last 20 plus years. We've seen that with relationships with, within our own hemisphere. We saw that recently. There's an extensive relationship with Venezuela, with Brazil. We've seen it in all over Africa. And so it's interesting to me that people can grasp that level of persistent, right, threat that's growing and advancing, advanced, as you described. How come you believe, and you've been in this from the beginning, maybe you could start with your own story, is how come it's so difficult for the American public to not be able to acknowledge that what happened in 2020 elections is indicative of that level of global threat?
Well, so the first thing I would say about that is the institutions that they would depend upon, which would be, first of all, government, and second, media, to inform them, were at best derelict. And I would say at worst complicit. So what I saw, I'll go back into my background. I'm not really a cyber guy. I'm a space and missile operator. That's what I did. But I also did a lot of special technical operations, which is the compartmented sort of, secret, we call it jokingly secret squirrel. Yeah. I did a lot of that within Department of Defense, from the tactical level all the way through, planning for new systems and requirements, and, writing orders for national defense authorities, writing orders for the president, writing white papers to inform the president about things that were happening and what should be done, that kind of thing. So I got that full experience, including doing the testing on the systems. When you do the operational testing, you have to be aware of the threats, because you're supposed to represent those threats accurately within the testing to make sure that those systems are survivable and can fight and are reliable in the operational environment with typical operators. And then, so I did that. I was on active duty for a little over 25 years. And then when I retired, my boss, who, I had a lot of respect for at Department of Defense under OSD, there's a directorate called the Director of Operational Test Evaluation. This is a presidential appointee who's Senate confirmed, who nominally reports through the Secretary of Defense, but really just reports to House and Senate Armed Services Committee. This is the guy who's the truth teller. So his job is oversight over operational testing of weapon systems. But as part of that, he gets to decide what he exercises oversight on. And so if they're testing, if they're developing, if they're modifying, he can decide he's going to have oversight. And because of that, he gets insight into what's happening in those programs. And then he does independent reporting to the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, because all the incentives in that defense procurement environment are set up, I could mince words, but it's set up to incentivize all the people involved to lie. Because if they tell the truth about problems in their program, they might lose funding. They might have to replan. And most of those are, they're capabilities that the military believes they need or want. And so they're very willing to do that. And so there's this whole structure where you end up, you're familiar with the story of like policy. Somebody up at the top makes a stupid decision, and down at the bottom, they say, this is garbage, right? This is trash. And by the time it gets back up at the top, it's reaffirming for them, telling them how great it is. Right? There's lots of skills. And it's that system. And so the Director of Operational Test Evaluation, I never wanted to go to the Pentagon. And so, but I took this assignment to the RAND Corporation to do some research that I wanted to do, very late in my career, realizing that they were going to then make me go to the Pentagon, which I'd never wanted to do. And of all the jobs at the Pentagon, none of them really was I well suited for, because I'm allergic to anything but just naked truth.
Yeah.
And the Pentagon and DC are not the environment. They don't embrace people who just tell the truth, especially, unvarnished the way I'm in the habit of doing. Especially because I spent so much time with operators and tactical units. When something's bad, I'm just critically aware that stupid decisions by higher headquarters kill people, and break national security objectives. And so anyway, I got brought because of my operational testing background with the Air Force Operational Test Evaluation Center, which, by the way, I had tried to hide. So I had taken a bunch of defense acquisition courses, and I got them successfully removed from my record because I never wanted to go do that in my career again. But they looked back at my assignment history and they pulled me into this office, and probably any other office would have killed me. Like literally tried to kill me because, but when I met first with
you were the disruptor, man. You were the guy who came in. That's messed up. That's messed up.
And the other thing is the director, when I got there, was Dr. Gilmore, and he didn't care about anything but the truth either. So my first meeting with him, usually you have an introductory meeting. My first meeting with him literally went like this. Sir, I've read all your policy documents. I read your remarks. I understand your intent. I believe I can execute it. If I can't, I'll let you know and you can relieve me. And we shook hands and that was it. And, wow. And that's how it went. And he was so Dr. Gilmore was like a 4-star plus equivalent within the Department of Defense. And, if the president wanted to fire him, he had to tell the Senate why. And so this was a guy who just cared about the truth. So that's what I got to do. And then when I retired, my boss asked me to stay on and help with a project called adversarial assessment, where we were looking at what, I think I still can't say who, but we were looking at what specific foreign adversaries had penetrated and exfiltrated from U.S. defense and national security establishment, including government and non-government, so including contractors. This was a massive, massive amount of data. And what became clear as we looked at this, we had a team, I was part of a team looking at it. And it went so well that we wrote a couple of reports that one went right to the president. The second one, the new director would not sign because he thought it was embarrassing to the military services. That's when I walked away and said, I only did this as a favor to my old boss. I really don't want to be in DC anymore. That was, I had gotten up one day in 2015 and wanted a Jeep, and then driving it home, I realized it's because I don't ever want to come back here. I want to go to the mountains and stay there. But I had agreed to stay, and I said, I'll give you a year. And I did. And we did this analysis. And what I saw in there was, foreign nation had, penetrated and exfiltrated massive amounts of intellectual property, had access to defense, and national security and weapon system design and technology. U.S. government, leadership was aware of it and didn't stop it. And there was no mistaking it. It was clearly a massive amount of theft. I'm talking about trillions of dollars of national sort of jewels, including information that compromised weapon systems that were fielded and weapon systems that were in development. So our reports,
oh my goodness,
identified specific weapon systems that we believed, based on what had been exfiltrated and the corresponding changes in the national security objectives and technology objectives of the adversaries, we believe they understood the vulnerabilities of our weapon systems to the point where they would not be combat effective. So in other words, we would send people, to war with them, and they would just be slaughtered. I won't say the specific programs, but there were programs that I said should be called coffins.
Oh my gosh.
Because of how thorough the compromise was. And there were weapon systems, including very expensive weapon systems, that were canceled. The programs were canceled because we identified that they were no longer going to be effective in a threat environment. And so that's what I saw. And part of that was seeing how thoroughly the adversaries had penetrated all these national security and defense establishments, the techniques they had used, the tactics they employed. It was, if you look at MITRE, which is a federally funded research and development corporation, if you look at their attack, ATT, and the and symbol, CK, if you look at their attack framework for cyber threats, we saw all of the elements of that taking place and being exercised against U.S. national security and defense establishment. And so, and I understood the capability level of our national security establishment in terms of cyber defense, how much resources and effort was being put towards it. And then, the flip side of that coin, how thoroughly it had been penetrated and compromised because of these gaps and shortcomings. Mostly from a policy standpoint. A great example is how the Department of Defense decided to go to cloud. So cloud was cheaper. Civilian communications infrastructure was cheaper. Both of them critically vulnerable. And I could, in a different forum, I could go on about some of the vulnerabilities we identified because they were vast and, dramatic threats to defense capabilities, including within continental United States. So anyway, that's the background. And then I got away from that. So the director refused to sign the second report. It got it to the president anyway, kind of a backdoor. It's a long story, but that's when I said, I'm done. And let me know if the director locates, I named a body part, but imagine it being associated with courage. And so, I never intended to have anything to do with government again. That was my hope and intent. And then 2020, November, election day, I voted. I'm sitting at home. I read an article about turnout here in my state of Colorado. And I thought, that doesn't seem right. And it just triggered in me what I had, been trained to do, which was research. Mm-hmm. I'd done research at Naval Postgraduate School, research with the RAND Corporation. I'm a trained, experienced researcher. And with a lot of expertise in some specific areas. I know a lot about cyber threats. I'm not a keyboard guy. I know a lot about the threat. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, I went to do some research, and the more I read, the more concerned I got. I started downloading data from the Secretary of State, doing some regression analysis to see if there were deflections in turnout and in voter roll status compared to prior years, and then looking for the reasons for those. And then I found out that they had the voting system manuals, test reports, and test plans online, as well as the standards. And up to that point, I knew nothing. Literally had never read a single one.
Never thought about it.
Nope.
Even back, you weren't like, when there was nothing about Clinton's response in 2016, that didn't trigger none of it. No,
I was busy.
Yeah. You were working your butt off.
Even when I was in DC, which was probably the easiest I'd had in 10 years in terms of workload, I was still, 50 to 60 hour week was pretty normal. And I would usually work at home, at nights and on weekends. If there were things I couldn't get done at work, I was doing them at home to kind of bring myself up to speed on especially technical issues. Mm-hmm. But prior to election day 2020, I couldn't have named a single voting system vendor. I couldn't have told you what the standards were, how they were tested, nothing. I knew none of it. All I knew was I had a ballot. I'd always voted on paper ballots, never on a computer. I'd had no choice but to vote by mail or absentee because military away from my home state, I'd done that for my whole career, basically my entire adult life. I came on active duty I was 21 years old. Mm-hmm. And, I had, after that point, I was almost never in my home state. So,
mm-hmm.
So anyway,
you see it that day, you start doing the research. What was guiding your intuition at the time? What aspect was it? The voter rolls? Was it the seemingly expansive turnouts that they were talking about? What was the trigger for that research?
There was an article in some, I can't remember the news source in Colorado. It was probably some local news TV station mm-hmm. or something. And it said, it made a comment about high turnout. And I'd been, I'd voted in person. I didn't drop it in a box. I went and voted in person. I didn't even then I didn't trust the drop boxes or mail-in voting. And, but when I read that article, I thought that doesn't seem right. And it feels like a rabbit hole that I fell down and have never come out of, because I started, I had done statistical research. I knew how to do statistical research, not very advanced, but I could do regression analyses and things like that. I had done that for my first master's thesis, and that was pretty easy. And I just started assembling data from different sources. But And I thought, this data doesn't look right. These significant, you don't see massive changes in turnout in developed countries. You just don't. Mm-hmm. You see them after the end of wars or after the end of a regime, or when there's a periodic change in sort of the society, like Japan, you go from Meiji Japan into a modern era or something like that. But you don't see them in developed nations. You don't see a 20% change in elections. It just doesn't happen, but it happened. And when I saw it first in Colorado, and then I started looking at the turnout data in other states, but I was really focused at that point on Colorado. I didn't realize what I was going to be doing. Something looked wrong. I started researching. It was just a pattern that I'd been involved in. But then when I started reading the voting system technical data, and especially the test report. So I said I'm not a cyber expert, and I'm not like somebody like Clay Parikh or Dr. Daugherty. Dr. Daugherty is, he's a real computer scientist. Clay is a real serious forensic expert for cyber forensics. Very experienced. Both of those very experienced in different aspects of it. I know a lot about the threat, but I haven't done keyboard work, at least not much of it in a long time. I did some a long time ago. In the military, I almost got court-martialed for it because that's a whole other story. That's one of the many times that, general officers have yelled at me in my career, probably for good reason. I mean, I was well-intentioned, but so were they. And, but when I started reading, what I am is an expert in testing. Mm-hmm. And so when I started reading the test plans for the voting systems, I thought, this can't be right. This can't be how they're testing it. And that's what led me to go back and read all of the federal and state statutes, the documentation out of the Election Assistance Commission, the voting system testing lab manuals. I started reading report after report, looking for evidence that they were doing adequate testing. Because I knew, I had just got done in 2016 or 17, I had wrote essentially a prescriptive standard for threat representation for Department of Defense space system testing, because It was inadequate. It wasn't being adequately represented in operational testing, and it had to change because we were fielding systems that couldn't survive first contact with the enemy.
Right.
And, so I'd helped the National Cyber Range walk through what they needed to do to develop. I had worked through with the developmental test side at OSD, what they needed to do to develop the resources and capabilities. I'd written some of the requirements for hypersonic testing. I understood what needed to happen, and I didn't see any of that in our election system and voting system testing requirements. And so that's...
And was that, I'm sorry to interrupt, was that at your local level, the county level, the state level? Where were you analyzing initially?
So originally I was reading the plans and reports that were associated with Colorado state voting systems.
Got it.
But they were test plans and reports that were executed by the Election Assistance Commission's accredited, not actually accredited, but they were supposed to be accredited, voting system testing labs. So at that time, 2020, there were only 2 accredited voting system testing labs. One of them was ProV&V out of Huntsville, and the other was SLI in Colorado. Most of the ones I read were ProV&V because that's who tended to do the majority of Dominion voting system testing. And from 2014 and 15 onward, Colorado Secretary of State had implemented this project called Uniform Voting System, where they had selected a single voting system for the state, and it was Dominion Voting Systems Democracy Suite, except for a couple counties which had essentially had to fight the state to get a different voting system. They won in court, and because of that, they had selected clear ballot systems. So there were 2 voting systems in Colorado, but Colorado, luckily for me, put a lot of the documentation online. And so I did the same thing I did when I was doing oversight of weapon systems, operational testing in Department of Defense. I would go read all of the technical data. I read every single thing I could find. And by the time I got done with that, once I saw how the systems were built, I was intimately familiar at that point because of both the operational testing oversight and the adversarial assessment project. I knew what our adversaries were doing and how. And I knew the threat to supply chain, which most Americans, never have to deal with or consider. You don't think about it. But the defense establishment does. And at that point, by 2020, it was pervasive. There was very few computers and electronic systems that were manufactured, in some cases, even in part, but let alone in whole in the United States. Most of it was overseas, and the majority of the overseas was in People's Republic of China. So when I saw the composition of our voting systems and the equipment and components they were using, I thought, well, there's a lot more testing that they have to be doing. And then I found out they weren't doing any of it.
Wow. All right. So let me back up with the supply chain, because obviously after COVID, which, I think was a component of the conditioning for the election for sure, but that's a whole nother story. We can go into later. Yeah. Whole other story, but all connected, right? I think people finally were recognized, our vulnerabilities, right? In terms of if we need something, right? Antibiotics became one, right? Then it was, all right, the chips from Taiwan, but it kind of petered out there. And so when you say supply chain and you say the components, you're talking about every board that's in every voter roll processing unit, of every check-in station, of every router that's involved, and then the Dominion machine. Like, you're talking about the literal nuts and bolts of how these systems were built, where they were built, and then the complete breakdown in the evaluation that our foreign enemy that's where these things are coming from. That's what you're describing, correct?
Exactly. That's
okay,
exactly
okay.
Right. So there's no industry in China. It's just like their telecommunications. If something comes out of China on the internet, it's because it was allowed by the Chinese Communist Party and the government. Mm-hmm. There's no industry or manufacturing that is not accessible to, if not accessed by elements of the national government, including principally Ministry of State Security, and especially when it is any kind of national security critical infrastructure or component for a Western nation, in particular the United States. So yes, every single voting system component used in the United States is using one or more subcomponents that are manufactured entirely in the People's Republic of China by Chinese nationals with access of the Ministry of State Security, which is sort of like a combination of our CIA and NSA mm-hmm. in terms of their capabilities and breadth of responsibility. But in some cases, it's the whole computer. It's every single component in it, including trusted platform modules that are supposed to be authenticating the other hardware. So imagine if you had security cameras at your house and the thieves were the ones that provided the cameras.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I would imagine with the work you had just completed about that threat assessment and how vulnerable we were, that you put in multiple reports, you see this and are reading this, and it must have been kind of not only, shocking's too little of a descriptive word, but like it probably to the point like, oh, we're under attack, like we're at war. Was it that guttural when you recognized the level of vulnerability?
It was, yeah. The phrase, and I've used this in a couple presentations, the phrase that immediately just popped into mind was "enemy inside the wire." Mm. So that originates with like the fence wire around the perimeter of a garrison or an operating location. Mm-hmm. And when you have an enemy inside the wire, that's worst case, because now you don't have a safe direction. Now you have to watch in every single direction. You've got sabotage, sapping, assassination all happening inside. That's the worst case. And when I saw what was being done with our voting and election systems, and just how poor, honestly, just how poor the security was. And it's not just the security itself, it's the mentality or culture. Like it wasn't even being questioned. So at that time in 2020, within the Election Assistance Commission, according to the federal statute, there's a technical guidelines development committee that develops the voting system standards. They're voluntary, but a lot of states require them by statute, require compliance for their systems. Colorado was one of those. And the statutory advisor to the Technical Guidelines Development Committee for the Election Assistance Commission is NIST, the director of NIST. And NIST had advised the federal government, all agencies, including EAC, in 2012, and then again in 2015, that the risk from supply chain compromises was severe.
Because it was the fact was that Dominion had been flagged multiple times prior to that over the course of their ability to penetrate and become the overarching, voting system, right? It wasn't new. Like this, people had from California to all over the country had already realized the vulnerabilities, and including the Democratic Party. We saw in 19, and when Kamala Harris was making her speech, like these votes, and they did a big documentary. I mean, it's wild.
Yeah, and this is so. I'll go back to a comment I made about the witting government officials allowing the exploitation. It's worse than that with our voting systems. So when you look at our voting systems, so you have to remember 2010, Dominion voting systems practically didn't exist in the United States. By the end of 2012, they had a huge market share and access. And the reason they had that is because of the Obama administration's Department of Justice. So Obama administration Department of Justice forced ES&S to divest the Sequoia technology and the Premier technology, both to Dominion voting systems, which really just a year and a half before was a Canadian voting system company. Mm-hmm. So they could have, and they did it under antitrust principles. So in other words, to enforce competition or ensure competition, that was the stated reason. But they didn't force ES&S to divest to an approved company like Hart Intercivic. They forced them to divest to Dominion, which really wasn't a U.S. They had registered at that point, but they weren't a U.S. company. First, they registered in Delaware. Then they established a second headquarters in Denver. But their headquarters was Toronto, right? They were co-located with non-governmental organizations that were very hard leftist leaning. They had already been associated with compromised elections in the Philippines. Their relationship with Sequoia, which was really a relationship with Smartmatic out of Venezuela, which was already identified by U.S. Department of Justice as being involved in corrupt elections in Venezuela. So the Obama Department of Justice wittingly and deliberately forced intellectual property associated with the ability to manipulate elections from both Premier, which was the old Diebold, which was the old AES or GEMS system, as well as the WinEDS stuff and Sequoia's, all towards Dominion voting systems.
Wow.
And I don't, I have to say this sometimes because some people think that there is a voting system you can trust. I don't trust any of them. ES&S fielded voting systems that had undisclosed telecommunications capabilities. Hart Intercivic had to be sued by a whistleblower, Key Tam under Fraudulent Claims Act. It was the Singer versus Hart Intercivic because they were lying about their security and the integrity and reliability of their election results and processes. And then, you get into a Clear Ballot, which basically is a derivative from ES&S. Same, software designer went from Premier to ES&S to Clear Ballot, Tab Iredale. Unison is wholly and completely owned by International Lottery and Totalizator, which is owned by Berjaya, a Malaysian registered company whose CEO has close ties to People's Republic of China, Communist Party leadership. So there is no, and that's our 5 top voting system vendors. That's 95, 96% of the US market.
Of all election market. All right. Thank you for outlining that complex issue. All right. So you are now doing the research. One of the things that I love that you talk about in your videos on your channel on Rumble, Cause of America, is the necessity to team up. And I really just, that just hit me constantly. Like you can't do this alone. And I love how you're guiding people to find people, maybe lawyers that have a skill in that, or accountants, or, to really kind of bring people together. At what point in your journey in 2020 did you recognize, I've got something that I'm seeing, I need to be able to confirm this, as well as tap into some of, somebody that has similar skill sets, or even better forensic skill sets, or whatever it might be, like Dr. Doherty, or I'm sorry, I forgot Clay's last name. Parikh. When did that moment hit for you? And then what, were you developing a tactical approach at that point yet?
No, so what happened was, at that point in time on election day, I was still involved with Convention of States. So I was volunteering with the Convention of States, and we had a weekly volunteer call, and we were waiting for everybody to show up for the call. There were some of us on there, and this was right after the election day. It was probably the Monday afterwards. And, I was just telling people some of the things I had found. And one of the people on the call said, essentially, "Oh my God, would you talk to my state legislator?" And I said, "Sure." And it was Ron Hanks in Colorado. Mm-hmm. And so, Ron, I talked to him for a couple hours, and I could tell he was kind of shocked when I was done. And he's another veteran, Air Force veteran. Mm-hmm. And he said, let me get another legislator on. It's Dave Williams. Well, Dave Williams was my state representative, so I knew him because I had spoken to him already. And so then I talked to the two of them, and they said, "Would you come and speak to the Legislative Audit Committee in the Colorado General Assembly?" And I said, "Okay." Cause, I back in DC, I'd spoken to, I've dealt with general officers.
Briefed everybody. Yeah.
Congressional delegations. They're all the same to me. I've got I'm never starstruck. I appreciate anybody doing their duty who's a faithful public servant, and I have no use for politics. And so anybody who wants to hear what's true, if I know it, I'll tell them. And so I agreed to go do that. And then we got on the phone with, prior to that point, I had made contact with a guy named Harvey Branscombe, who's a lifelong Democrat. And he was an election integrity researcher, for 20 years in Colorado before I had ever even thought of looking at anything. And so, but I had read an article that was written by he and someone that I had worked with that I knew and respected. And I said, "Hey, will you introduce me? I want to talk to him about some of these things." So then, Ron Hanks and Dave Williams got together with us on a call with Lori Sain, and Lori Sain was the chair of the Legislative Audit Committee. So unbeknownst to me, actually they didn't do it. It was another citizen activist, and she asked me to talk to Lori Sain. She just brought her up on the phone, and Lori Sain will talk to Harvey and I and said, "Will you guys be a panel at this hearing?" And Harvey and I said, "Sure." And so I was in person, he was remote. We showed up, and but the committee turned in, because it was a bipartisan. It happened to be chaired because they rotate it. Even though there's a super majority in Colorado with the Democrats, it was at that point chaired by Lori Sain, who was Republican. Mm-hmm. And so without that, they never would have had the hearing. But they had the hearing. I didn't even know how the hearing had come about. The hearing had come about at the request and with the sort of pressure from other citizens who I didn't know and didn't meet until I was at the hearing. And the reason I met them is because inside the committee room, they had chairs for the presenters as well as witnesses or audience. And they were, all 6 feet apart in this kind of diamond pattern. And I was standing in there, and the closest guy to me was a guy I'd never met before. His name was Dennis Haw. And he and I started talking, but I didn't have a mask and had no intention of wearing one. He wasn't wearing one, but the sergeant at arms came and told us both to put them on. And I said, that's not going to be happening. I'm not going to be doing that. And so they made me leave the room. Mm-hmm. And so I had to stand out in the hallway. I stood out there, 8-9 hours while the hearing was going on, waiting to testify. Dennis was so pissed off because they basically used all the front time for the people who were telling them what they wanted to hear, which is that everything was great and fantastic, and look how good we graded ourselves and we got an A. And Dennis was another retired Air Force officer. He was a mathematician and he was a computer scientist in earnest. He had helped design some of the original 386 BIOS, sitting literally next to Intel's Andy Grove. And so Dennis was the first guy I met who had a technical perspective that was, complementary to mine. And he and I started talking. But then out in the hallway, I started meeting the people who had been responsible for pressuring to get the committee hearing to begin with. And that was people from Colorado's USEIP, which was a citizen grassroots organization. And that was Ash Epp, I think Tom Bjorklund. There were some other, some people. I didn't even know who any of them were. And until that point, I wasn't connected to anybody. And then later on, some of the people from El Paso County that Dennis had introduced me to, and El Paso County is the largest county in Colorado, population-wise. It's like neck and neck with Denver, but I think it's ahead now and growing more than Denver is for good reason, right? Denver is, they turned it into just a disaster. Yep. It's Venezuela up until this last week.
That's right.
And so I was talking to those guys, and Dennis was connected to the USEIP group, which I had not really followed up with or talked to. And Dennis said, hey, will you go talk to their data people? And that's how I got involved with USEIP. That was February of 2021. So I had no intention when I started of doing anything. I was curious, and that led to concern. And then when I expressed my concerns, other people said, wait, this guy knows something. And then we started working together. So that's how I got involved in the whole thing. And I'm still down that rabbit hole. I've never gotten out of it. So,
I mean, if you love the country, regardless of what your politics are, and you give yourself an honest opportunity to listen to what you and a lot of these other experts are saying, there's quantifiable proof that our entire country is compromised right now. And we saw the outcomes of that within the last administration to just, as in a smaller capacity than what it ultimately could be. You listen to Elon Musk on Rogan, he said, this will be the last election if we lose. And I think anybody who had been paying attention since 2020 and put all that together, I think you can argue that the Trump's first term was like, what is going on? Like, this is bizarre, right? What's happening internally, what's going on with his directives, not manifesting overseas, and I had a lot of friends still doing work overseas. And for me, the big one was finding out that when he had said, all right, get everybody out of Syria. And then my friend Scott Wirtz got blown up, in the winter with Shannon Kent, Joe Kent's wife at the time, and a couple other people. I was like, wait a minute, that's not right. Like they were ordered to be out. We shouldn't have been in there, but they were still in there, and I was like, all right, this has gotten out of control. But then 2020 obviously was just like all flags go up in the air. When obviously from November to February, a lot of other things were taking place. Obviously, I mean, from to Rudy Giuliani and Bernie Kerik trying to do these town halls, to get in front of these boards, to present evidence, Sidney Powell and this other group that was like, something's wrong. And then, Bernie told me this great story, that they went in after the couple nights and they called an emergency meeting with Trump's team. And he and Giuliani showed up at the main offices in DC thinking there'd be, standing room only. And there was a one attorney showed up and was like, we're done. It's over. What are you trying to do? And they're like, wait, what are you talking about? And that was kind of another, heads up, like, oh, this is something deeper. Right. Did all of those external things, because now you're realizing something's afoot. It's deeper. It's more. It's systemic in nature. In the malevolent Machiavellian way known. How did you start to come up with a tactical approach, right? I remember my buddies that were a part of the red teams back in the 80s and 90s at Damnick would talk about, right? We would just find a thread, right, on a base or wherever we were, and we would just pick at that thread until we couldn't pull any more on it. And if there was vulnerability, we just kept going and kept going. What were some of the threads that you identified quickly? Like, all right, this is where it's obvious, and I'm just going to go down that route.
Well, the first thing I'd seen was the voter rolls, so I knew there was an issue there. But I'm not a data guy. I mean, I can do some data work, but I'm not a pro at it. So at that point, USEIP already had a data professional, a guy who was a serious data professional. I won't say the company, but he's the principal data guy for a major healthcare company. And those guys live and die by their data.
By data, for sure.
And so he was the one principally that was digging into voter rolls. And I had already seen some things that I knew could not be true. But I didn't have the tools that he had, but I understood how to dig into computer systems. I knew and so once I saw what was going on with the voting system testing labs and how that was like kabuki theater, right? That was a placebo for people. Oh, it's federally tested. Well, but they don't have any cyber capability. They're not experts. They're not forensic cyber people. And they're restricted in what they look at. And they're not even looking at most of the software on a voting system is commercial software. They're not examining the commercial software because they have an assumption and assertion that is already tested and those issues are evaluated. Well, then you look at cyber vulnerabilities that have been publicly identified in those software products, and you start asking, well, did they mitigate? Have they addressed those vulnerabilities that are already known in the commercial products? And the answer is no. And then when I found out, they had no supply chain security whatsoever, literally, it wasn't even mentioned in any standard until 2021 standard, which means none of the voting systems in the United States had any security or mitigation whatsoever against supply chain vulnerabilities. And again, there were elements of the federal government that were aware of that. And so that was, I was focused on that aspect. But I have to say, and, Doc Frank has talked about this. Doc Doherty has talked about this. I think Clay has talked about it. Mike's talked about it. Dave Clements has talked about it. All of us, and I call this the blinders of morality. So I've done red team work. I've done red team work for physical penetration. I've directed red team work for cyber and for other threats. So I can think like an enemy. And there are times when I haven't thought like an enemy. And it's an embarrassment to me because I have the background that should have prevented that. And it's a perfect example. So I wore a plate carrier on the plane when I flew to without plates in it because I thought that's going to really alarm these people. And when I got to DC, I stayed with a friend. The night before, I fabricated expedient plates for the plate carrier out of ceramics and metals because I assumed we were going to be attacked. Mm-hmm. But at that point, I still, even though I had concluded in 2017 in late 2017, early 2018, based on some of the work that I was doing for the adversarial assessment program and some other support work, I had concluded by that point that there were elements within the U.S. intelligence community that were committing against the president. And I can't go into detail about that, but it was not a natural assumption for me. And when I became aware of it, it was a little bit, it shook me a little bit.
Of course.
But even at that point, I wasn't looking domestically. I just didn't have that. That's not where I'd looked my entire career. I'd been focused on overseas, the away game. But anyway, so I started to connect some of those dots and see some of the not just negligence among public officials, but deliberate decisions to allow or look the other way neglect to prosecute, neglect to mitigate. So I wouldn't say it was a complete picture, but we were hampered at that point because all of us, I think to the last, thought, well, we'll just tell leaders, public officials what's true, and then they'll do the right thing. That's how naive I was.
Right.
I call that, I think back to the verse, when I was a child, I thought as a child, I spoke as a child. There's a naivety to that, which was surprising to me after a career of dealing with threats. I just didn't have that mindset yet. But once we started talking to public officials, by probably April, May of 21, I bet I had talked to 60 election officials in different counties or at the state level. I'd had state level officials in multiple states lie to me about in answering questions I was asking, watch them lie to legislators. I had heard county level officials lie. I'd had them lie right to my face. In some cases, they didn't know what they were saying. They were just saying what they had been told to say. They didn't know the difference. But they knew that they were being told something. They did have no ability to verify, or determine any of the answers to what they were saying themselves. Like they would say things to me that they got away with saying to the general public or to media that didn't have the skill set, the background, or the will to question them. But I knew better with some of the things that they were saying already. Like, I had the elections director in Colorado tell me, oh, no, there's no connection to this system. And he said that to me on the phone. And at the time he was saying that to me, I was looking at the technical documentation from the vendor that said they required that application programming interface connection to the statewide registration database. So an API or application programming interface is a machine-to-machine interface. He lied to me directly. And I then saw him lie in many other, his name's Judd Choate. I don't mind calling him a liar because he is one. He lied in a criminal manner. And I had seen so many of those by late April, early May. At that point, I knew, okay, this is not going to be I thought this was going to be just exposing the truth. It's not going to be exposing the truth because we were being opposed, suppressed, targeted by media, by institutions, by the government, the federal government at that point, state government. I was effectively, an enemy of my state and an enemy of the state at that point. And I got it, I got it mild. Other people were getting it, they were getting around. I was I was on the steps. I saw some of those things go down there. And, I thought what I had to worry about was the leftists. What I had to worry about there was my own government. So when I saw what my own government was doing, how it tried to make that into something that it wasn't, and then with media to describe it inaccurately to about what was happening, that's when I think I realized first then that it was going to be a very different fight.
Oh, for me was the recognition of that, we were in a color revolution. That's when it was confirmed to me, right?
Yeah.
The lead up from the year before with COVID, one, just the Russiagate stuff. I was like, this is a soft coup for sure. And then COVID, and then the BLM stuff, and then when myself and a lot of other guys just start getting throttled and shut down, and the cancellations ramped up to just shut all of our voices down, all the military guys down, right? And I was like, this is what effectively the intelligence community's been running all over the world for the last, since probably Bosnia, or you can argue it in different forms prior to that too. But this was the playbook. This was the Maidan revolution. This was the whole thing. And so for me, by that time, like I'd lost my career. I'd lost everything. So I was in this dark, depressive state. And every time I'd get excited about someone like you or one of your other compatriots out there that were making these advancements and discoveries and presenting them as we've been narrowed down to Rumble and Parler and, the other places at that time.
Smaller and smaller silos.
Yeah. Just narrowed us down to just a few available delivery places. I was just like, okay, how is this going to break through, and what are we going to do? And it was it was probably one of the darkest experiences I've ever had in my life, other than the Afghan pullout. That was depressing for me. Obviously, the bin Laden raid followed by Extortion 17 was brutal for me. When you realize, wait a minute, how is this, and you start to question all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's the great challenge for the American public, and has been. As obviously, one of the things that really impressed me about David when he came on, and you can, there's just the way he speaks, right? The sentiment that's in his voice of that all in tone, but it's calm. It's like, no, this, like, I imagine this is what you guys feel like the guys at the Alamo, right? Or you feel like, what some of the Knights of Malta on that island where they, like, it's just, this is it. This is where we're at. Did you, in that April time frame, was there any place where you felt like momentum, like from other people, like you were gaining traction? Or was it just, because that's I think what people want to understand is, how do you stay invested in this for so long when nobody's listening and it's the biggest issue in the world? Like, how do you keep going?
Well, a lot of people, I would say were inspirational, but, remember, I'm an officer. So my job is that, your emotions don't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're encouraged. Your job is to be that, to execute the mission. Once you see it, and it's a mission I didn't want. It's a blessing and a curse, right? But once you see your duty, if you can ignore it, then you're just not that guy. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm not the guy that can ignore my duty. I might misinterpret it sometimes, but I can't ignore it. So once I saw it clearly, but there were, Dave Clements was one of the people who helped. It was, again, Dennis Haw introduced me to him. So Dennis, unfortunately, with he and I had some discussions before he took the first. His company required it. He ended up having a heart attack on stage. We lost him that way, as far as I'm concerned, our government, and which is not just, considering what he gave to the nation. But he had told me about David Clements, and it was because David Clements had I think Josh Merritt on, and then they were talking. The three of them were talking, and I, working with USCIP, the Colorado grassroots group, we had realized some things. We had, identified some techniques. Our objective was to connect everybody and then to share what was working and what we knew. If we developed a tool, we wanted to share it. If somebody else had a tool, we wanted to use it. And our objective was to, link grassroots groups and share for success, to try to win together, to try to restore together. And so I had reached out to Marilyn Todd in New Hampshire, because I saw a Facebook post from her. And so I tracked her down and said, hey, what do you need? And she told me what she needed, and we didn't have it. But I reached out to David Clements and asked, hey, will you talk to her and help? I did actually the same thing with Jovan Pulitzer when they were looking for somebody to help with their audit. So again, through Dennis was connected to somebody down in Arizona. And when State Senator Fan was sort of leading the Senate audit effort there, she was, in charge, in effect, from the Senate. They didn't have cyber expertise. And so they had asked for some recommendations for some things, including who could look at ballots. And I had done a lot of work and research looking at what question document examiners did, what tools they used, what capabilities they had, what their throughput was, looked at the problem set in Maricopa. And, part of my recommendation to State Senator Fan was, this was all sort of, behind the scenes. We weren't talking about this with other people. It was sort of considered, I wouldn't say, secret or anything like that, but it was,
you wanted to have some OPSEC for sure.
Well,
because
yeah,
I'm sure there were people trying to penetrate you guys at that time by far.
There were, we would get them all the time. And in fact, some of them were media that then went on to write false, fraudulent stories that then led to us being targeted by some of the civil rights NGOs that came and sued us and accused of us of violating KKK Act, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. We beat them in federal court, although the appeal is ongoing right now, but that's another story. But anyway, I had recommended Jovan Pulitzer for the paper audit to assist Marilyn Todd in New Hampshire. I have a different perspective about him now, but at the time I thought, well, he's the only one who's described any kind of technical capability to produce ballot examination at the throughput level required, for the periods of these audits. So there were a lot of people like that. I mean, they're just coming out of the woodwork. We were not all connected at that point. At this point, I would say it's very rare that I hear a name that I'm not familiar with if they're doing something significant in election integrity. Not because they, come to me or anything like that, but just because we try to help people. And if there's somebody doing something that we don't know how to do or that we're not the best, we try to get them connected to them. So
that's fantastic.
So there were a lot, David Clements, who I'd say was one of the first people to be doing any kind of long format discussion about election integrity issues. And so he became known for that, right? He took an interest. It wasn't something he had a background in either. But at this point, and he and his wife, and he'd probably say this too, but Aaron's the smart one in that couple. And David's pretty smart, but Aaron's a smart one. So, we talked with them about some of the work in New Mexico, which I had lived in New Mexico before. I understood some things about New Mexico politics and political environment. And so there were a lot of people, there were, including some of the sort of, I would call them like original gangsters in election integrity. I wasn't even aware of it. I didn't know the Collier brothers. I didn't know Bev Harris. Now I'm great admirers of those people who were doing that work. I would say they tried to warn us. Sheila Parks, in her 2012 book, While We Still Have Time, she was another Democrat educator. So there were a lot of people that just weren't well known because the legacy media, mainstream media did all it could after 2019, especially after mid 2020, to just shut down any discussion. Right. It was like the end of history,
Yes.
They didn't want to even acknowledge what Wyden and Harris and all those people, Ron Wyden, what they had said in congressional hearings about the threats and vulnerabilities.
Thank you for that context. That's fantastic. Because what I want people to know is that there is a significant group that have dedicated thousands and thousands of hours in this collective effort to categorically disprove that was the safest election in history. And I think the more people understand the technical expertise, the patriotic commitment to the country, your services, where people are coming from, what they've sacrificed. I mean, for God's sake, look at Tina Peters, staring at 9 years of incarceration for doing her job. I think, that's one of the things that is finally breaking through as well. Here's this Gold Star mother, mother of a team guy too, and was willing to just go against the system, and the system is still in place where they can incarcerate her. Can you describe her case just briefly? Because I'd love to have you back on in the near future so we can go down the legal aspects of the whole thing as well. But just to kind of wrap up this first show with you, can you describe Tina's case, why it's relevant in the grander context, and what it means for the proverbial chokehold on the system, if you will, that's hanging on by the threads now before this thing just explodes?
Yeah, I would say, so let me start with something that'll you'll see it right away. Other people will maybe realize at the end. So, at one point, I'm trying to remember the year, but Saddam Hussein is still in control of his entire country. He's got a chokehold. It's he can kill anybody he wants. His sons are murderous little bastards. It's just, it's a death camp. The whole country is a death camp, and who dies is whoever Hussein decides dies. And then, a couple weeks later, he's in a spider hole on the plywood. And that is the, modern day, and same thing with Maduro, right? Big talker. And, it's like Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And next thing you know, Maduro's on a U.S. plane headed to the United States, drinking U.S. water, surrounded by U.S. people. And that's what the phrase sic semper tyrannis means, right? They abuse, they exceed. And at a certain point, it's just not sustainable. Something breaks, they lose control, and it's all downhill. There's occasionally where if they're smart and not too egotistical, they have some sort of an escape route.
Right.
But anybody who holds on, a tyrant that holds on eventually is, they all meet the same fate in some sense. So I think it'll be that way in Colorado. I think the tyrants, and it is tyrannical. And now the specifics on Clerk Peters. So Tina Peters, as she's described herself, she was just, like most of us, derping along, doing, private business, commerce, whatever, her own life. And then she, like happens with so many of us, she got irritated by the long lines at the DMV in her county. And she thought, I guess I should do something about it. Her son was gone, and she thought, okay, I've got a civic I can fix this. I got a civic responsibility. So she ran for clerk with no idea. She wasn't a political insider. She had no idea the kind of ire that she would incite among the political insiders. But at that point, the election, that particular office was not something that the individuals and organizations that really were controlling the voting systems and election systems, it wasn't something they were trying to secure. And so she got into office, but the institutions immediately arrayed against her. The former clerk partnered up, colluded, a Republican nominally, colluded with the Democrat Secretary of State to try to recall her from office. They tried to blame her for some ballots they found left over in a ballot box. And before she even came into office, it was the election that elected her, right? She had no responsibility or capability to affect it. So that was the environment. But she really went into that clerk's position to try to fix some of the things she saw. She wasn't an expert in election. She was probably like me, in 2020. She didn't know anything about it before she went in.
Right.
But then citizens started coming to her and saying, hey, this isn't right. And I think they saw some things in the 2020 election, but really it was the municipal election, Grand Junction, in the spring of 2021, where is nominally a nonpartisan election, but every one of the individuals that were elected or selected, as the movie says, every one of them was proponent or espoused really very strong leftist perspective about government, collectivist perspective in a town, in a county that really leaned heavily Republican and conservative. So these are people who are not fans of government. And yet you have every one of these public officials in this election gets elected. And none of them were the kind of people that the population was likely to select, if you just had an open, transparent vote. And so she started, looking into some of these things without really the tools or much support. It was just a discussion. She thought she was doing her job. Then she found out for the first time there's a trusted build coming. She didn't know what a trusted build was. Most of the public doesn't know what a trusted build is. Trusted build is, how most bills in Congress are named something that's the exact opposite of what they do.
Yeah.
So I don't know who trusts a trusted build. The population's supposed to trust them. The theory is that it's, that's something that, the public should have trust in. But the way they conduct them is such a violation, not only of federal and state law, because they're destroying election records when they do them, but of the public trust. But anyway, she hears about this trusted build. She knows that her ballot marking devices on her county election systems are printing a QR code. She's been told that QR code is what the optical scanners actually read in order to tally the votes from those ballots. And she's told that this trusted build that the Secretary of State and the vendor Dominion Voting Systems are going to implement is going to modify her voting system so that her voting system no longer reads QR codes. And her first thought, or at some point her thought is, well, how am I going to verify if I have to do an audit what was on the ballots? And the truth is she wouldn't have had a capability. So she's worried at that point. She's connected to citizens. Those citizens are connected to Dr. Frank. Dr. Frank is connected to Mike Lindell, and Mike Lindell is connected to some cyber people who were connected to him because he didn't have cyber people. He didn't know anybody who did that until the 2020 election. So, Mike Lindell's attorney at that point, who's doing a lot of the election work, is Kurt Olson. Kurt Olson doesn't know a lot of cyber people. They know one cyber guy that, was recommended to them. And what Clerk Peters knew was that she had asked for support from the Secretary of State. They wouldn't help. Had asked for support from her own IT department in her county. They would not help back up the records because she was afraid she would not have the ability to look at those ballots again. She wanted to back up. It wasn't like, oh, Trump won, I've got to prove it. It wasn't there was fraud, I've got to prove it. It was, how am I going to be able to do an audit on records? And also by that point, I personally and other people were advising her, you have an obligation to preserve all the log files and artifacts off those systems because they're necessary to the audit trail. It's literally described right in the Federal Voting System Standard, the 2002 Voting System Standards, which is a statutory minimum requirement for that voting system in Colorado.
Wow.
And so she was aware of all that, yet couldn't get any help from any of the other election officials or state officials. So she asked, do you have somebody who can help me? The first person they had was Jerry Wood, and Jerry Wood was not a forensic guy. So he didn't have experience or like an intuitive, innate understanding of how to preserve those records in accordance with federal rules for digital evidence that the FBI and Department of Justice publish. So she asked for help. Dr. Frank didn't know the guy. He asked Mike, he asked Kurt, and they had a guy that, was the only guy they knew, or one of the only people they knew. So that's how the cyber guy, that's how Conan got. And I was on a phone call with them, with Conan. I didn't know his name. They didn't say his name, just trying to help them evaluate whether he knew what he was doing. I was asking questions about what he knew about the voting system itself. Right. Whether he knew what he was going to be doing in order to, make a backup of the records for her to preserve, which is, that process of preserving those records. It wasn't just she wasn't just authorized, she was obligated by statute. And if you look at the 2021 DOJ guidelines for post-election audits, it's very explicit about the obligation of every election official to preserve the records that are within their control and domain. And explicit that they had the authority to provide them to someone to retain on their behalf as long as it remained within their administrative control. None of what she did for that process was any violation of any state statute or a rule. The only thing that she violated apparently was not telling the Secretary of State about the specific name of who would be present during the trusted build process. So that was the background for her. That was what got her to that point of making the backup. Up until that point, the Secretary of State didn't know. Not for the pre-trusted build backup, which documented the system that was left over, I would say the residual from the 2020 and 2021 election, nor for the post-trusted build, which was the new version, which had, overwritten the active partition on the hard drive of the voting system. Totally unnecessary, absolutely against normal practice, and a violation of state and federal law to do that. And remember, Secretary of State Griswold directed that trusted build in every county, right? There are literally thousands of voting system components on which her direct guidance and mandate overwrote election records. She violated state and federal law. Clerk Peters only violated a rule of the Secretary of State, which, by the way, was
illegal in the first place.
That's right. That's right. So this is where the supremacy clause comes in. And this is why the absolute refusal of the judge to allow the affirmative defense of her intent to comply with a federal law the role of the supremacy clause. That's why that judge's actions are so corrupt in the Peters case. And then especially in her sentencing, where, he not only talked about her intent, which was false, he talked about his fear that she would say things basically that he didn't like. I can't even imagine, the corruption involved in allowing a federal judge or a state judge to sit on the bench when they think it's okay for government to restrict or police or imprison someone to prevent them from speaking.
That's what the whole thing was. She's the biggest threat, right?
Well, it's that, and they really had to set an example, right? That was a message to every other election official. Federal government won't protect you. The law won't protect you. Doing your duty won't protect you. If you oppose the, elections or challenge or even question or even try to do your job, your actual duty under the law, we're going to come after you with everything.
That and the defamation cases, right? That the ridiculous rulings on all of that. We're an hour and about 20 minutes in. We've given the audience a lot to think about. Thank you so much for the deep dive. If it's okay, I would love to bring you back on. We'll go into the legal framework and the technical framework of how it actually took place from a technological perspective. And then that way people can have, both of those, because those are really the nuts and bolts of how this was conducted, I think, for sure. Legally, through Mark Elias and the preparation that they did prior to, and how are they going to knock down anything that arose. And then also, I think, the technical aspect of how they were able to get into those machines. And but we'll do that again. To wrap up this particular show, Colonel, as you're sitting in that seat right now, and it's beginning of January 26th, obviously the news cycle is kinetic as I've seen it, and what's going on the streets and overseas is actually becoming kinetic as well. How would you assess the necessity for this issue to be addressed prior to the 26 midterms?
Well, really, we've got till the end of March, because that's when the midterm primaries begin. Mm-hmm. It's the issue. And the reason it's the issue is because it's the bedrock. You see how, I would say, derelict Congress is in implementing any kind of election integrity support to follow the president's executive orders. There's no question about the reason, necessity for them, and yet Congress refuses to act, right? They've refused to act to remove judges that are acting, complete contravention to their own oaths of office, right? Just absolute nonsense coming out of the judiciary. Even the Supreme Court, has not recommended censure, even when they're just 9-0 destroying lower court judicial decisions. You still have an activist judiciary, and Congress is doing nothing about it. The reason they're doing nothing about it is because, many of them are likely not elected, and they're not accountable to the people. There will be no accountability. I mean, the executive branch will do what it can, but even that is, severely infiltrated. There are a lot of holdovers and a lot of people who have conflicts of interest and other loyalties, which is pretty evident, when they execute what looks like poorly, executed. It's real hard, it's real hard, tigers until they get into office, and then lambs, right? Mm-hmm. Lions to lambs. So, from my perspective, and this is why I've been doing this, since 2020. That's why, and in earnest since 2021, and why I can't lay down the responsibility is because I think this is just like the last one. This is our last election. If we don't get some transparency and some integrity restored to our elections, then the last 2 years of the President Trump's administration are going to be either frustration or a rollback. It doesn't matter what they do from the executive perspective up until the midterms, it'll all be reversed and worse, right? I mean, I earnestly believe that. So from my perspective, it's the issue above all others.
Well, I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate your dedication, the work you've done for this country, both in service and now in the real service, as we're in this definite war for the future of our children and our country and our children's children. I commend you, sir, in what you've been doing. Where can people follow you, and then how can they get educated themselves?
So I'm part of causeofamerica.org. And so you can go to causeofamerica.org and there's a huge digital library there. I was going to say that earlier, when you looked at the 101 videos, those are not me. I'm talking on a lot of them, but what really, again, a team, you need a team. I'm not the data guy. We've got a chief analyst. He runs all the data ops. We've got a digital librarian. Amy does all the video editing. If she wasn't doing that, it would just be me blabbering, chain, whatever came into my head. She makes those coherent so that people can digest them. We have a digital library. I don't know how many, 10,000 docs or something in it now. Everything we can find, from forensic reports to the documentation for the voting systems, statutory interpretations, everything, you can find that there. And we also have links to other organizations. We're agnostic about where people get their information as long as it's accurate and helpful to them. And so we'll connect people to their own state organizations if they're not already connected, so that they can get in the fight. I like to say there's no citizenship happening on your couch. You have to engage. If you do, and if not now, then when? This isn't for me. This is for my kids and honestly for the, people I can't repay.
That's right. That's right. Amen. Thank you, sir. God bless you.
My privilege. Thank you.